king the world, and a set of imperatives and prerogatives were established as well. A value system was introduced. A conceptual system was introduced. A way of thinking and treating of the people was introduced. So when we talk about trying to destroy that myth, we are not simply talking about the introduction of contradictory empirical evidence which shows beyond a shadow of a doubt that their assumptions of their initial Genesis entrance into the Western world was done prior to anyone else getting here, and the overwhelming evidence that that cannot be the case. It's not just simply the empirical counterproduction. It is something that is more fundamental. And the challenge to us is to take the data, to take the data that our scholars are laboriously pulling together, bringing pictures in living color, bringing evidence, taking you to the centers, taking you to the front, letting you stand and look in the eyes of the old heads and say, hey, bro, what's happening? I mean, going down to a very concrete confrontation. The challenge is somehow taking that and beginning to shatter the mythology in your own minds that begins to permit you to begin to operate out of a new and different paradigm. Now let's look at what this was. Columbus's alleged entrance into the Western world was the establishment of one of the early colonies of white supremacy. The subsequent declaration that it was a consequence of their exploration, their science, and their interests, and their industry, and their technology, was to establish a perception of the world which says that not only are we here because we are great, we are here because we belong here. It is the destiny of our greatness and our right, to establish our presence here, and our right to subdue the inhabitants is a necessary consequence of our divinely given and scientifically provable greater superiority. Now, the idea behind this is that this opened the door for the subsequent 500 years which we've come to know. The subsequent entrance of the slaves into North America from Africa was simply a continuation of the laboratory of white supremacy that was being established in North America. It was a laboratory that was initiated with the assumption of the right to engage in a genocidal attack against the native inhabitants. It said that we are not here as friends. We are not here as fellow human beings. We are not here for the purposes of cultural exchange. We are here because God has endowed that we have a right to be here, to rule this, and to take it from whoever currently occupies it. Now, the agenda was clear, because almost from the moment of entrance, there was no effort to interact, but an effort to subdue and overcome. The subsequent bringing of the Africans into this environment was done to continue to perpetuate the idea that a new paradigm has been introduced. Now, this paradigm, of course, was in contradiction to what had existed in Europe for the previous 800 years. Prior to 1492, all the way back to about, about 892 AD, the Moors, Berbers, and African people had been the only civilized inhabitants that were in Europe. They were there as, not as guests, they were there as clearly superior military people, but were there with the respect for the dignity of the people. The Moors did not engage in genocide. The Moors did not engage in the decimation of the culture. In fact, there was very little culture left. Only because the medieval European insanity which represented a devolution from the high level of advancement that they'd been able to garner from their exposure to the African experience in the Nile Valley that gave birth to culture in both Greece and Europe. They had devolved from that because of their lack of complete understanding of what they'd gotten. Now, because of the decline in culture during this entire, what they called, I didn't call it, they called it the dark what? Ages. That was their description. They said themselves, the lights have gone out. And they went out because they forgot where they got the electric power from. And they didn't pay the damn bill. That's why the lights went out. Okay, now, so the lights went out. And therefore, throughout that entire period, Europe began to degenerate into a barbaric, uncivilized, culturally defunct horde of nomadic people engaged in nothing but warfare and other kind of predatory activities. In other words, they returned to the barbaric conduct that had characterized them before they initially invaded the African continent and began to sit under the light of the black masters in the Nile Valley. That's exactly what had happened. Now, they resisted learning the right way when they had the right first exposure. It wasn't long before they undermined the culture where they'd come to visit. Even though they were speaking the language of the African people, wearing the clothes of the African people, talking the talk of the African people, using the science of the African people, wearing the costumes of the African people, worshiping the gods of the African people, and everything that they had that gave them any culture was of the African people. They had to engage in that consistent conduct which has characterized these people from Europe since their earliest days of descending out of the Caucasus Mountains, and that was to begin to undermine and destroy and to divide and to conquer and to destroy the foundation of the culture they'd encountered. So the Africans had to salvage what they could in secrecy and running away and hiding in other parts of the world in trying to get away from this infiltration and this captivity which had occurred. Now, we are suggesting that because of the revival, the Renaissance, which they call themselves the Renaissance, you know, the Renaissance, but they gave credit to somebody over in Italy and somebody. But the Renaissance, you know, as you'll hear tomorrow, I'm sure in the presentation on the Moors, that the Renaissance was a direct consequence of the presence of the African Moors, the black Muslims and Berbers who were there and occupied Europe for that 800-year period. So it was there. The educational center of Europe was there in Spain. The cultural center, the architectural center, all of the kind of learning that was going on in Europe for that period was located right there in Spain under the auspices of the black people who brought it to them. Now, even though we brought them out of the dark again, they did the same thing the second time that they'd done the earlier time. And that was they resented the fact that they had been lifted up by a black hand. And so they then vowed that their agenda from that day on would be to avenge themselves against these African people who had brought them culture, but who had demonstrated their lack of development by their inability to recover themselves into civilized life. The idea of what happened then is that they were determined to prove in a vindictive and in a reactive way that we are therefore superior to people of color anywhere. We are, by virtue of our skin, endowed with a greatness comparable to none. We will compromise with no one. We will engage in exchange with no one. We will demonstrate our superiority by the capacity to capture and destroy. And then we will claim what's left as our own. So the paradigm that was initially introduced with this invasion was to establish the paradigm of white supremacy. We are the greatest, we are the best, and fundamentally anything of value comes from the European white reality. Now, this is so essential because what you have to understand is that